Okay, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're joining from, for this session of the 12th Patio Conversation, for which is on the theme Writing Histories that Yakin, Inger, and myself coordinate. And today we have two very interesting presentations lined up. And we will be joined in the first one by Sarah Melsens and Ishita Shah. And thereafter, we will have Pamudu Tennakoon, who will also show her research. And what connects both these sort of bodies of work is the fact that they are looking at human voices and oral histories. So in a way, we are looking to write histories with very different methods than the normative sort of archives that us historians refer to. We're also I want to underline the fact that ideally in a situation like this we would have had one of our one of the or one or more of the studies participants join us, but again as researchers we are bound by certain ethical frameworks and the ideas of consent. So in a way, it is our speakers who will be presenting their voices in the various scenarios that that they're going to be talking about. So quickly to uh, let everybody know, especially those who are joining us for the first time, about how we'll run the session. So we'll have Sarah and Ishita first speak about their work, and then we'll have Yakin introduce the next speaker, after which Pamudu will show her research, and then Yakin and I will run kind of a round table where we respond to the two bodies of work that we've seen. And it'll be a conversation between us and the speakers first. And thereafter, we will be throwing the floor open for questions. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first two speakers, Sarah Melsens and Ishita Shah. So Sarah is a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellow at the French National Center for Scientific Research and affiliated also to the FLAME University in Pune. Her research centers on the history and ethnography of architecture and construction in colonial and post-colonial South Asia. And she has a particular interest in everyday architecture and the contribution of forgotten city builders in the public works department as well as independent entrepreneurs. She's also the co-editor of the ABE Architecture Beyond Europe Journal and Construction History Society. She's taught architecture previously at and continues to do so at CET University Ahmedabad, and she's also a founding member of PAHA, or the Pune Architectural History Archive. Ishita Shah, who's trained as an interior designer and an architectural historian at CEPT and the Bartlett School, respectively, has been developing a community-based curatorial practice. And she's invested in making invisible histories visible from India and South Asia in general. And her work is situated at the intersection of a self-founded archive, which is called Curating for Culture, which he runs, from where two critical initiatives have emerged called Constructing Personal Archives and a digital repository of histories of women practitioners, which took shape as an exhibition a little while back called The Women of Vastukala. So she is also currently a consulting archivist and curator at the Patani Archives in Bhavnagar, the Queer India Archives in Mumbai, and the Neil Morgan Estate in Ooty, Shreyas Foundation. So she also, in addition to her curatorial and archival practices and archival research, teaches in various programs in design, history, curation, and technology. So I will now let Sarah and Ishita take over from this point about their fascinating research on the Wadar community. And over to you, Sarah and Ishita.
Hello, everyone. Excited to be here today and talk a bit about not just the results of the research, but also the processes behind conducting research and especially working with community members. What I'll present today is part of a larger research project. I'm going to speak in a very candid manner, so feel free to also interrupt me when things are not clear. I am going to present something that's part of a larger project, a 3-year project hosted at FLAME University in Pune and the CNRS ESS institution in France. And we have a very strong collaboration with Curating for Culture and Ishita in particular, who has been fundamental in this project in working with members from construction workers communities. And she has collaborating with us with regards to how to organize workshop with community members, how to present research results on social media, but also through exhibitions, which is part of the project and the proposal of how the project was written from the beginning. So the project is on the edge of construction and labor history, and it's guided by 2 rather simple questions. One is, so speaking historically, who did what on the building site? How are tasks of labor recruitment and supervision organized? And the research is focused on the city of Pune, where I've been living for the past 12 years. PhD research, so I had quite some acquaintances in the architecture world, also with contractors through my PhD work. But I was very curious to know more about the building site as a space where different social groups come together, and how.
So we seem to be losing Sarah's connection briefly. Ishita, do you wish to come in while we're waiting for Sarah to rejoin internet-wise, or we can just wait for a little bit? Ishita, we can't hear you.
So I'm not audible, is it? Oh.
Yes, I think we lost you briefly for a few moments. So if you want to just proceed from after you mention the questions, that would be great, please.
Yeah. So these are the larger questions which inform the research project.
It might help if Sarah turned off the video, and then we might be able to hear it.
About
Sarah Petro, maybe.
Historically, and because there's traditional archives that speak about the buildings in detail, which are normative. Yeah. I apologize for that network. I just is this better with video?
Yeah, we're just waiting for Sarah to come back in. I think she's had a network problem.
Satoshi,
Hello.
could we go with Pamudu first? Would that
Yeah,
work?
let's do that. Pamudu, are you comfortable coming in first? And before that, Yakin would briefly introduce you and your work.
Yeah, sure. I'm ready to present.
Okay, thanks, Pamudu. So Pamudu is a PhD candidate in history of art and architecture at Brown University, where she also completed a parallel MA in anthropology. Her work aims to understand the continuous reimagining of colonial cities and instigates how people traverse previously colonized spaces and relate to the material remnants of colonial and post-colonial pasts in South Asia. Research has been supported by the Social Sciences Research Council, the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia, Society of Architectural Historians, and Brown University. So with that, we welcome you to share your presentation and work with us.
Okay, can everyone see my presentation? I just want to make sure and hear me. Okay, great.
Yep, we can.
Thank you so much for having me here today. This is so wonderful to speak here. I'm also going to speak a little candidly. So if you have if something's not clear, please feel free to stop me and ask questions. So I want to kind of set the scenes for my dissertation work before we start. So in my dissertation, the entire dissertation, it started off looking at multiple buildings. It was intended to be a multi-site case study based look at how colonial buildings are understood in contemporary society and how that speaks to ongoing processes of decolonization, which is something that I've been very interested in for a long time. That's what I did that was a part of my undergraduate research and my master's research, which I did with Pedro actually, and then now my dissertation. But when I started my fieldwork, I came to do fieldwork in Colombo, Sri Lanka, at the height of the economic crisis. And within a month of me being here, there was a fuel crisis. There was hundreds of thousands of people pouring into Colombo to protest the government and to oust the then president. And during that process, the people's arigaleya, as they called it, the people's struggle, occupied the president's house, as well as the presidential secretariat and the prime minister's official residence, all of which were colonial buildings. And that occupation went on for a few days. And during those days, people planned and orchestrated tours through these buildings. It was very organized in that sense. And then in being there, I was able to see how even though many of these people have never been inside these buildings and never probably will have a chance to be in these buildings again, they were having very intimate relationships and connections to these buildings, whether they were talking about the renovations, whether they were looking at the paintings, they were looking at the buildings, they were taking selfies with it. And that led me to realize that I wanted to do a work that was a little more intimate, that was based on not multiple case studies. And that returned me to this one building, the Soysa building, which had been destroyed the year earlier. So the reason I start off with this painting by Prasad Hettiarachchi, he's a wonderful artist. And in his work, he's very critical of the current gentrification of Colombo, which is what led to the destruction of the Soysa building. So this painting I came across when I was just at his exhibition, and I noticed that this building looked familiar, and that was the Soysa building. And in this work, he's critiquing the gentrifying efforts across the city that led to this building's destruction, as well as the destruction of many other buildings, because the land on which these buildings rested were reclaimed by the government and sold to foreign investors. And in the case of the Soysa building, it was sold to the Tata Housing Corporation. So in this work, he also then builds on a lot of different types of painting, whether that be South Asian or colonial, to critique the government that is sitting within what looks like a court painting while everything around it is being upended or destroyed. And he also showcases how in the gentrification, there are different parts of the building that come out. There are different flyovers that come out that are never completed. That the gentrification is destroying a lot more than it's building. So what is the Soysa building? So the Soysa building is that particular building, and it used to look like this. It was a block long 2-floor shop house complex that was in the center of Colombo in a neighborhood called Companhia Vidya. That neighborhood is also called Slave Island, and that is where the Dutch, as well as the Portuguese, primarily the Dutch, held enslaved people that were brought in from the Swahili coast as well as from Java and Malaya in Sri Lanka. And it used to be an island, it used to be a peninsula. It is no longer. And this building had stood there for close to, it was about over 100 years. And it is a shophouse complex, and it was designed as such. So after the 30-year civil war ended in Sri Lanka in 2009, the government began beautifying and developing the city into a world-class city, which is very common rhetoric that happens across the global south in many ways, the idea of wanting a world-class city. And these efforts actually continue to this day. And as a part of, as I mentioned, as a part of this rejuvenation efforts, this building was destroyed and the land was provided free of any encumbrances to the Tata Housing Corporation. And this reclamation of this building took a while. It was in 2013 that it was first told that the building would be reclaimed. And then it was not until 2021 that it was demolished. So in June 2021, the building collapsed. It partially collapsed. Nobody was hurt. But the government then used that as the avenue to clear out the entire building in the next 2 months. And this was also during lockdown that all of this is happening. So my dissertation through the Soysa building asks, how have colonial architecture forms and styles become ingrained in histories and cultures through the post-colonial to the contemporary? How do people continue to occupy and traverse once colonial spaces, and how do they relate to the physical remnants of the past? And how do engagements with colonial architecture reflect and speak to ongoing processes of decolonization? And primarily through my work, I argue that it is through quotidian, daily, as well as artistic acts that people decolonize on a day-to-day basis. That isn't top-down governmental idea of decolonizing or slapping the label of decolonization on something. It is in living with these buildings in the post-colonial through the contemporary that people are actually making it more Sri Lankan as opposed to it purely representing the colonial past. So the method I employed to understand the Soysa building, I call it fragmentary archives. All archives are fragmentary. But in the case of the Soysa building, the building itself was destroyed and it was in fragments, even when I started doing my research. And also the archival work, the archival documents that pertain to this building were spread across both personal and more national archives. And they were mostly sprinklings of any information about it. But also those documents that I was handling, they were literally breaking apart in my hand. So that's why I call it fragmentary archives, because the Soysa building in its archives is both fragmentary conceptually and physically. So what became evident to me in working with these archives, both oral histories as well as documented archives, as well as artwork, was that they didn't always agree. The oral histories didn't necessarily agree with archival histories or vice versa, and there was a lot of disconnect. And by engaging in methods from art history, architecture history, and anthropology, specifically, like I mentioned, oral histories, archival work, and close looking and deep engagement with the material, I wanted, through my dissertation, find ways to have these different competing narratives rest together with some discomfort, some productive discomfort. So when I first went into the archives, as a very young PhD candidate at the time, I mentioned that I was researching colonial architecture. I wanted to cast a big net and see what would come up. And at this point, I had narrowed down to working on just the Soysa building. So the first thing that was placed on my hands was the 20th Century Impressions of Ceylon, written by Arnold Wright in 1901. It is basically a veritable who's who of Colombo elites. And in this, there was like a brief mention of the Soysa building. And then it popped up again in trade books. And then it popped up again in newspapers and postcards that I managed to find from different places. And in the newspapers, they talked about all the different people who lived in it. And there were classified advertisements, crime reports, and opinion pieces that are written by people who lived there, about there. There were cases of people being robbed in that building. So there were a lot of things that came out through the newspapers. And then I spent a significant amount of time speaking to both the current owners and the residents of the building. And the residents at this time had been forced to move out, and they had been given not adequate compensation. There was a court case going on. So I managed to talk to a lot of people through that. And that provided me an insight into how the building was being used, how they were relating to the building, and how they viewed the history of this building, what they viewed to be the history of this building. And some of these occupants of the building, even though they were tenants for the most part, because it was still owned by the de Soysa. So the building was named the de Soysa building because it was built by Charles Henry de Soysa. He's the man in the middle, that little sketch. He was the wealthiest Ceylonese of the 19th century, and he owned so much property across Colombo. There were, Anuma Pierce's book talks about his private holdings, and there were about 40-something houses that he owned and mansions. And on the left next to him holding a plan is his descendant who continues to own the de Soysa building. So I got a sense of the family history, but also in talking to the residents, they talked about some of the objects that they kept from the building. For example, the timber that you see bottom one off from the left, that is held by one of the residents of the building. He wants to use it if he ever builds and something else, builds another home. And then all the way on the left-hand corner, you see the brick there, and that is actually a brick from the de Soysa building that was taken by an artist named Chatrini Sansala, that then she has intervened into that piece of brick to create a new artwork that speaks critically of the building's destruction. So I know that this is a very crowded slide, and I laid it out this way because for my work, all of these fragments are quite equally important, both archival documents, oral histories, contemporary artworks, all of them, though they often highlight and showcase the gaps in another. Often the oral histories showcase a gap in something else, and sometimes they don't align. For example, when the building was being destroyed, for a lot of newspapers covered it, especially after the building collapsed. And a lot of newspapers said, oh, built in the 1870s, this 150-year-old de Soysa building is under demolition. And they focused on when it was constructed. They sometimes focused on who built it, as in who funded it. And they focused on the age a lot, as well as the fact that it was a colonial building, even though it was built by Charles Henry de Soysa. So it is a colonial building in style, but actually it does not trace back to colonial authority having been built by a Ceylonese man of incredible wealth. A lot of publications said 150-year-old building. And even the paperwork, because there were many activists trying to save this building, even in that paperwork that was trying to get it listed as a heritage building at the Department of Archaeology, they list it as being built in the 1870s. But when I approached the archives, I came across documents for the land sales of that site, and it unveiled that the land wasn't even bought by de Soysa until 1880. And then, which led me to looking at the surveys, and then as well as newspapers. And the first mention of a building being there didn't come till 1882. And 1882 and 1870s is not a big gap, but 1880s also doesn't give that rounded headline of 150 years. So in my work, I place those two things together to show both what the newspapers were saying and what people truly believed it to be and lived with this inherent knowledge that this building was 150 years old, and on the other hand, what the archive is unearthing. But similarly, when I was talking to residents of the de Soysa building, I came across one family, the Pasela family, and they also provided family law that they lived with that often challenged the traditional archive. But I don't think that is any less important, because these people lived with these buildings, engaged with these buildings, and made these buildings their home in believing this. So I met on screen, and this is a clip from a film called If These Walls Could Speak. And this documentary, directed by Sishan Akram Jabir, focused on the de Soysa building in the months leading to its destruction. And in this, only one of the residents was willing to speak on camera, because they all feared that there might be retaliation from the government. They might lose some of the promised compensation. But the owner of the Q, which was a billiards and snooker cafe, and his daughter Mahima spoke on camera. And since then, I have also interviewed Mahima separately, as well as her mother, and alongside many other people. So Nur Suski Pasela actually was a third-generation resident of the Soysa building, making Mahima a fourth-generation resident. So Nur's grandfather set up a billiards room in the years preceding independence, and since then, the building has gone through many changes. That particular unit has gone through many changes, with it going through different changes in use, as well as some renovations on the inside. So in the film, in the documentary, Nur Suski divulged into the history of the building beyond his own family lineage. He listed the histories that he had heard from his ancestors, stories that even precede him living in that building. And he did a lot of this storytelling and I will show you a clip right now, through his own experiences, specifically experiences of the material that he found and he engaged with in living in the Soysa building.
Through my grandfather's and mother's information, this was an office. From that end to this end, you can walk. After, yes, this building, these were all office building, because when we dig behind here, there are big nut and bolts. That means all coffee machines were put here. 18 time, these were all caves building. These were all British-made building. This is design building. Even the wood, we are all Burma teak and this cos jack, and all very hard. Still you can use for another 100 years. This wood, they have an opening in the center of this thing, the arch, they have builded arch. They were closed one by one, and one people as occupied after the Caves and Company, and they withdraw.
So a lot of what he said in the documentary, as you saw, centered around, it was British design, it was British built, it was owned by the British-owned H.W. Caving printing press that was located in the building. And they were located in the building in the early 1900s, in the early 20th century. As well as he focused on the ephemera that he found, like the nuts and bolts, and what that indicated to him. And then he also talked about how this building was a single building that had been subdivided later on. And it was one with British roots in design and construction, but in ways it diverges from some of the formal evidence surveyed by architecture historians and conservation experts. And it also moves away from what has been said in the archives about this building. For example, archival documents present a building that was built and owned by a Ceylonese man and funded by the very same. The newspapers highlight the multiple simultaneous businesses that present in the Soysa building dating all the way back to the early 1900s. And the exterior facade shows clear shophouse demarcations, dividing units, while even more newspapers mentions refer to the structure as the Soysa buildings in the plural. So as you see, it says Soysa buildings, and it was only later on it became the Soysa building. But for Nur Suski, his engagements with his home is mediated by the histories that he knew of the Soysa building. His knowledge is further connected to the building through the act of finding those nuts and bolts upon digging, which he attributed to the presence of a machine and therefore a factory or an office of some kind. So unfortunately, after fighting hard to save the Soysa building, Nur Suski Pasela passed away from COVID-19 merely weeks before the Soysa building was destroyed. And it is with this context that I spoke to Mahima Pasela, his daughter, as she recounted stories from the Soysa building. And a lot of what she knows about the Soysa building, even though she herself has lived there and have firsthand experience, comes from her father. So I'm going to play a little bit of a clip from what Mahima mentioned.
So is my dad, because he actually knew a lot, because he was big into like the history of the building and stuff. And one thing that I'm definitely sure about was the building used to be a factory. Mm-hmm. And this is, I'm sure about it because when you look at the building, so basically there are these arches in between each separate like section of like, so you can see that this was one big thing that was separated and made into shop houses eventually. So apparently, my dad said when they used to play when they were kids, when they used to dig in the ground, they used to find like nuts and bolts and like batteries and like electrical bits and stuff like that. So he said that this was like some factory run by, he said Italians, I don't know, run by them, where they like built like metal things, like nuts and bolts and stuff like that.
So this, as you saw, the story of nuts and bolts reemerged with Mahima, and these narratives of this building are integral to her understanding of the space, its history, and the narratives that she actually carries of her own home. So in my work, I reiterate that oral histories are not merely recorded, but passed down from one generation to the next, and in families and communities, and cultivated collectively. With the conversations with the Paselas highlight that this discourse around architecture should not solely rest on the historical importance placed on names like the Soysas, or the names that might appear in traditional history books, but it is imperative to emphasize the lives led within. And the oral histories, even if they do not agree with archival histories, provide an understanding of the histories that people carried with them of these buildings and how they engage with these buildings. And a lot of what has unearthed, and I use this photograph because it shows Mahima as a child and her brother drawing on the walls of the Soysa building. It has since been painted over and now destroyed, but they have left something in them too. So a lot of these fragments that I found are not in the archives, but also in photo albums and in little pieces of building that have been found. So by refracting all of these fragments that I have found, I aim to demonstrate that though not all of these sources align, they converge in the lived histories of the Soysa building, and they mingle when it comes to the material. So I know I spoke really fast and I took up a little bit of time, but thank you so much.
So thank you, Pamudu. That was fascinating. I mean, I have a lot of questions for you, and personally, and it's really rich work. And thank you for telling us the story so well in such a short amount of time. And I'm gonna try and bring in Sarah and Ishita now.
Yes,
Finish
sure.
their presentation before we start the roundtable. Sarah, I hope things are stabilized.
Yeah,
somewhat. Yeah.
so I'm trying another network, and Ishita will share the slide. So hopefully that will sort out things.
Okay, over to you guys.
I hope you guys are able to see and hear me.
Yes, this is perfect.
And we'll go on full screen mode. Yes, over to you, Sarah.
Yes. So as I was saying, I'm not sure where I left you guys, so I'll just quickly summarize. It's what
I
I'll
think
present to you.
Sarah, maybe try bringing us back to the questions that you began
Yeah.
with, and then go from there. Yeah.
So we can go a couple of slides, maybe to the next slide then. So the project tries to look at the building site from a historical perspective. It's focused on the city of Pune, and we're trying to answer relatively simple questions, which are who did what on the building site, how were tasks of labor recruitment and supervision organized? And a second question, as we are looking at the long 20th century, if we can go to the next slide, the second question is about what did changes in material do to skill hierarchies or perceptions of skill, which are hierarchically organized but not necessarily logical. So finding information about the building site is not self-evident. Many colonial archives have normative documents about construction work, such as building specifications, but it's hard to find actual memories or stories or narratives about how the works were actually executed. And so one of the primary sources we use is photography, and we're gathering building site photographs from various private collections or even published works. And the second thing is that we're trying to use these photographs in oral history engagements or public engagements, as I will show further in the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, the result will be a set of microhistories where I describe particular building site processes for specific building projects. And one such project is this 1923 bridge constructed in Pune called Shivaji Bridge. And there was recently a celebration of the bridge centenary, and the contractor associated with these colonial works organized an event. And that was a clue for me to approach this contractor, because his name is there on the bridge as well. So I knew the name, but I didn't know how to find this person. So through the event, I could reach out to the contractor. And if we go to the next slide, I was also already in the possession of 2 photographs of the building, and we can see the British governor on the first row on the chairs, but right behind me with the white dupatta-like element is the contractor with the mustache. And so he was his descendants are still into construction. They are real estate developers now, and they were one of the first persons I interviewed. And similarly, I was working on different sites in Pune trying to trace connections to the building sites. So if we go to the next slide, it's a parallel work of identifying people related to the project, as well as some visual documents, or if archival material is there, of course, that's also important to put next to the other evidence. And so here we can see the same bridge under construction, a photo from the Public Works Archives themselves. And so as I approached the contractor, Ishita, we can, they provide a further trace to the construction workers. Next. Ishita, can you hear me? Yeah, perfect. So the grandson, who is himself already 80 years old, I think, or great-grandson even of Kanpatrao Kenjle, mentioned how when he was a child, he remembered mukaddams or foremen coming to his ancestral home. And he mentioned that they used to come from Wadar. And so Wadar is this area in Pune where a lot of members from the Wadar community, some would say it's a caste, but they have many subdivisions as well, settled. And there are several areas in Pune, which I came to know later, which are associated with this community. But one in particular, different contractors kept referring to Wadarwadi in Shivajinagar, which is a particular area across the river of the old core of Pune city. And it was also clear from the interviews that these mukaddams or foremen had quite a substantial role in the construction, that the contractor would consult them before submitting their tenders, probably to get rates, because the Wadars are stone workers, earth workers, and masons in the 19th century. They eventually evolved into concreting work. So both contractors referred to them both for concrete work as for stonework and earthwork. So different contractors I interviewed mentioned the involvement of these foremen. And so it became clear that this was an essential community to look at and to engage with. So we, in the next slide, can see that we ventured. So Wadarwadi is nowadays considered to be what some would call a slum area. So it's a very dense settlement, and it's located in a prime area of the city, which later developed around it, basically. And so we decided to go there, Ishita and me, one day. So we had the luck that we had this contact point and somebody who could take us around the first day. So in the next photograph, I think you can see us visiting. So he said, Rakesh is his name. He said, okay, I'll show you where the temple is and some of my old community. And I
Sarah, we do keep losing you in between. Do you want to
Itself,
switch off the camera and then talk only till the part you present? Because we do keep missing you in between.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, so we had the luck that Rakesh was with us on the first visit, and we at the temple. So there is a temple which is quite central in the settlement, we immediately met some senior members of the stoneworker community who were very happy to talk to us. And from them, we understood that, yes, there was definitely still a lot of memories about construction work, even about that particular bridge, which the name Kenjle of the contractor, before we even mentioned it, when I showed the picture to the senior man in this photograph, he himself mentioned that, yes, there was a contractor, Kenjle, who had recruited us. So if you go to the next slide, I think that's where the quote is there. So it was fascinating that things connected so well. And that's when Ishita and I tried to come up with a way to engage with, especially with elder people who would have some memories of early or mid 20th century construction sites, often through the stories their fathers or grandfathers told them. Okay, next. And what's also particularly interesting is that we could also find women who had worked in construction, and that's something which is absolutely difficult to find in the records. And this shopkeeper, for instance, was herself a daily laborer, and even her ancestors were. So we catered our engagement to, have information from this group, which is very hard to find. So in the next slide, I think we have the layout of the, oh yeah, and then of course we also had the luck to find this social study about the same area, which a sociologist wrote, published in the 1990s, but it's based on fieldwork in the 1970s. And this was, again, mostly based on oral histories. So there are some lovely quotes in the book as well. So we had a rough idea of the history of the settlement based on this work. So before we did our community workshop in this settlement, we already had a background idea of how it evolved. So in the next slide, you can see that summarized. So yeah, this is the area, how the area looked in the early 1900s. According to the book, there were only about 20 huts, and it was owned by big landowners. And yeah, the settlement was done without formal land tenure or agreement. And by 1940, about 100 huts are there. There was also a stone quarry in the area, and many of the workers were working on a college, Ferguson College building, which is nearby. So they basically, it evolves from a labor camp to a bigger settlement. And these are photographs which found in the town planning department. So they are of the same area of the city, maybe not necessarily that settlement, but it gives an idea of how the area was like before. And this is a current aerial image where the old core of the settlement is the one in the middle. Interestingly, the book also mentions that in 1948, they got land tenure officially, and there was a Wadar cooperative housing society established. So that's when 62 plots were purchased by community members. And they did have to buy the land, but they built it themselves. And they also cooperated to purchase material through the cooperative. And then in 1961, there was a big flood in Pune. And so a lot of construction workers who had been squatting the riverbeds, which were typically the areas in the city where temporary labor camps would come up, they were officially moved to this area. So the Pune municipality provided some, very less, but some housing. And there was also another cooperative housing society started in the west, so on the left of the image nearby. And that was more a society for earth workers, whereas the central one was the stonecutters community. Okay, so that's the background. And in the next slide, you can see the program that we worked out. Oh yeah, this is also one of the archival images. So in the book, there are some mentions also about the materiality of the settlement. So the author speaks about early migrants using bamboo matting to make their huts. So new people who newly arrive in the settlement usually build with bamboo first, and then they use mud brick housing, etc. So this was the situation back then. And with that background information, we set up an event in the settlement. And we decided to go for 3 days and to cater to 3 particular themes, let's say. So on the first day, we wanted to query this history. So as Pamudu also said, the archival evidence is not necessarily matching up to the oral history. So we wanted to test out what community members knew about the history of their area. And so it was focused on Wadar through history, the first migrants, how the settlement developed. The second day, we decided to focus on women only, to have a discussion group, which was more looking at the main research questions of how is work organized on the building site, what kind of work is attributed to women, what are the particular challenges women face on the building site. And then the third day was catered to men. So this was the rough idea of the workshop. And we occupied a space. Yeah, before we started, we of course had to ask permission from community members. So we had, through Rakesh, we had met a couple of social workers, as they call themselves, but they are basically community representatives who have done a little better than others maybe, and who kind of speak for the community. And yeah, they helped us conceptualize the program. And we chose a place near to the main temple where we set up a temporary pandal. And they helped us also spread the information. And this is then what the setup looked like. So we had brought our findings, our archival materials, our photographs to the settlement and created a kind of pop-up exhibition. One important choice for the visual materials were really helpful here, because there's of course a language. I speak a bit of Marathi, but they have their own dialect as well, which is Wadari. So language is not very obvious in this context. So we use a lot of photographs and videos to kind of show the material we work with. And this included those images which we found in other archives about the materiality of the settlement, the construction materials. And also we had prepared some map, because the book does mention that a cooperative housing society was formed. So there was some formal planning and some subdivision of land, but the current aerial images don't allow to see that. So one of the tasks we had in mind was like, maybe we can retrace the original plan of that cooperative society, which proved harder than we thought. But yes, there were some efforts to do that. But it's interesting because they told about the bus service running through and each plot having its own garden, which is very difficult to see right now. And even children, of course, were happy to visit us. Yes, next. So this is the part of retracing the original cooperative housing society. This is an inauguration plaque, which is still present. Some minister visited at the opening of the housing society. And then we could identify the original stone houses. So this is one which is still in a good condition. Many of them have been demolished or rebuilt, but this is one of the original 1960s houses, so built by the workers themselves. And usually they are twin houses, so usually 2 brothers or family members share a plot. This is a similar house, but there's an additional floor built on top. And since they are stone workers, the houses are of dressed stone, and they can last, of course, very well. So several of them have been preserved. And this one especially gives a glimpse of the kind of, I mean, when you see this type of house, it shows a certain status that the workers had at this time. And I think that's something that was something I didn't expect. When you enter the area, you don't realize that it's transformed a lot over the years. This is some photographs of the engagement with the women, especially the senior ladies were very, very talkative and gave us a lot of information about when they arrived here, how the settlement used to look. They shifted houses within the settlement several times. I think, yeah, we can go a little faster. It was also great to have them read into the images, because there are certain images where we couldn't identify what exactly these workers were doing, and often they could help us and explain. For example, this was the compacting the gravel on the road, I think. So there was a special tool for that, which is something they recognized. And we also made small video clips, which are available on our website as well. So sometimes naturally different groups of people came to the pop-up and there was an interactive discussion. At other times, individuals came and we had time to actually record their statements with their permission, of course, but we were able to do quite a lot of oral history interviews, which were recorded as well. And especially the senior members had a lot of information to share. For instance, they talked about how their fathers used to make drawings, which is also something we expect them to only be busy with their hands, maybe, but there was evidence of how they used stone cutting templates, how the temple, which is built in the community, was actually drawn by them. So there's definitely a lot of knowledge that is not yet known, that can be gained from such interactions. So here we see the discussion about the history of the society. And some very intimate quotes, and I think that also in a certain way links to the identity making. I don't know if Pamudu also spoke about this, but oral history is also about collective remembering and portraying an identity, and you could feel that even the members of the stoneworkers community who moved to other fields, they still have these ways about talking about stonework and their relationship with stones, even though they're not themselves actively doing this type of work anymore. They still have this intimate knowledge of the trade, which this is how the children interacted. So we had also devised, so that one of the aims is also to come up with a vocabulary, because the workers use different words for tools than the ones that we find in building specifications, for instance. So one of the games was a kind of puzzle where we asked children to use stickers to match the tools in the drawings with those that they could identify in the pictures. And this is an ongoing work where we are trying to map the different vocabularies. And this is, a reflection on the evolution of the settlement, where in the late colonial period, it was a kind of informal occupation of the site. And then it was formalized shortly after independence. They were able to buy some of the land with the help of contacts in parliament. They were able to, according to the oral history, they were able to convince important politicians to get this officialized. But many of the well-to-do workers from the community have by now moved out, and so it's now really a place where new migrants arrive. So there's a huge pressure on the settlement. A couple of thoughts on the methods. So I think for us it was also surprising to sometimes hear them speak with a lot of nostalgia almost about the stonework projects that the community used to do for the colonial period, and something that they really spoke fondly of. Then there is also the whole performance, so the idea of identity making in the present. So there is almost like an origin myth of the community where they're trying to, especially in the current climate, they're trying to claim their role in the making of Shivaji's forts. And so there's a whole passing down of showing why they're an important community. So they're trying to claim political rights as well through these histories, which is fascinating. But on the other hand, how do we, as a historian, accommodate such sometimes conflicting stories? And then how do we embrace these different interpretations of the past? So I think taking this forward, it's really, as Pamudu was doing, it's about putting all the different types of evidence next to each other. But I do think it's a very enriching way to work, and we do get to uncover stories which we don't have access to unless we do this. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Sarah and Ishita, for again a very insightful glimpse into your process, and most importantly, there are many common themes you have shown and what Pamudu has also presented. I'm gonna, for the audience, also invite Yakin to tell us just over a couple of minutes. I know we are running a little over time, but there is a context for how we develop this particular PATIO conversation around the theme of the community as an archive, and what motivated us. And I'll invite Yakin to speak about that a little bit before we respond to what you've seen, and then eventually open the floor out for questions.
Thanks for the presentation, Ishita and Sarah, and thanks, Saptarshi. So just to give a bit of a context of how this panel, or this roundtable rather, was thought of, Swapnil, my friend, and I, we've started working on the Kumbh Mela in Nasik, which is like a cyclic event which happens once in every 12 years in Nasik and once in 3 years in other 3 cities of India, which the next Kumbh is coming to Nasik in 2027, which will have the different projections have different number of people, but around 40 lakh people or 4 crore people, sorry. So the range is really vast, and the idea was to look at the history of this event through community memory, because there's not much in the archive which is accessible, if there is any. So the idea sprang up from there, where we're trying to look at an event which transformed the city. So not looking at the Kumbh as an ephemeral event as it has been shown, but looking at it as an event which transforms how the city evolves. So I think with that context, we started looking at what are the ways in which we can think about community as an archive. How can we tap into this resource and think about, as architectural historians, what histories can be brought to the forefront, what histories can be highlighted when we start looking at the community. And I think in both the presentations, in the first presentation with Pamudu, you were talking about the people's lived experiences with these buildings, and in the second, where Sarah and Ishita presented their work with the Wadar community in Pune, the community's architectural memory plays such an important and integral role. And I think in the first case, you're talking about how inhabiting that space or occupying that space in that building is a part of the making of the community's architectural memory. And in the second, it's the work and the labor that goes into the building as process that leads to the architectural memory of the communities. And I think that's what you tapped into. And here I also want to think along with you, where communities and archives also a methodology for labor histories, material histories, construction histories, but also the afterlives of buildings in Pamudu's case. So maybe, Saptarishi, if you want to add some of your observations and comments, and we can open this roundtable with that.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to just pick up on a couple of things and just summarize for our audience. So several important problems, if I may, emerge from what we have seen. So one of these, what is common to both the presentations that we saw is really the fact that when I mean, of course, the obvious part is that there are contradictions in what is fact and what is memory. And so, as architectural historians who are mediating what is reported to us, we are confronted with the problem of narrating somebody else's memory, as it is remembered. And there's also this popular sort of aspect of oral histories, which is about, when you remember, you in the first instance you remember what happened, and in the second and tertiary instances you remember the remembering, right? So how do we sort of make explicit our positions about memory becoming an important resource for writing histories? So in Pamudu's case, particularly, I mean, I was very struck by what you said about productive discomfort in the juxtaposition of what the official, I mean, or the public narrative is in terms of the reportage, and what was remembered, and how that sort of inflects the public narrative, and also the archival material. I mean, I really loved how you connected the crumbling building to the crumbling archival material. And what does that say to us, for instance, about the role of a historian, an architectural historian, and how we navigate what is reportage and what is fact, because I think the premise on which history as a scientific discipline is founded is evidence, right? So now here we are moving beyond, we are reconsidering what evidence might be, and we are complicating the whole idea of evidence. So I would invite Pamudu to reflect on that. And before you come in, a similar kind of issue arises. I know I'm being like a devil's advocate, I think, but even when Sarah and Ishita, you look at photographs as a medium or the object of constructing your historical narrative, in how would you like to reflect a little bit on your roles as mediators of this material? Because again, there is something that is reported to you by the community, and they're also, none of these things are apolitical in a sense. They are ways in which these communities are also claiming identity, and they're claiming their roles in the making process, right? So the photographs are an evidence of the making process, but we all know that photographs are not neutral, and they select, they curate, right? And so how do you go through these multiple layers of curation in writing a history? What I'm essentially asking uh, both of you, or both the bodies of work rather, is that in what ways do you make explicit the incompleteness and the fragmentary nature, as Pamudu very explicitly said, of the histories that we are writing, and how do we sort of, how does how do the narratives we produce stack up against the sort of more canonical ways of doing history, where evidence becomes like the center of what is valid and not valid. So I'll just leave it at that, like with a couple of questions, and you guys are welcome to sort of respond as in whatever way you please. So maybe we'll invite Pamudu first to respond, and then we can have Ishita and Sarah.
I think if we are gonna treat, for me, if I'm gonna treat the Soysa building as an agent, and I'm gonna treat the people who are providing oral histories and as an agent in my writing, in my scholarship, the archive has to be an agent. I think for me, I write about the nature of the archive. I write about that because I think it's important to show that incompleteness in my work, because to show that there are things that slip through the cracks of the archive. There are things that some might not deem to have enough information in a historical sense to write about. But I think there are still stories there to write. I think archives often are used to provide importance to something, and there are lived experiences that are able to do that as well. And when you start from there, I think it's important to have the archive be an agent. And I think the fact that the building was crumbling, the building was destroyed, and the fact that the archival documents were also crumbling, that peril also pushes against the idea of often, especially with heritage architects, this idea of permanence or of prolonging. And this idea that, like, for me, at least, I went in with a preconception, or like going into history, you assume archives are curated, they are there for the long run. They are there for the long run to exist for people to go and pick things out. But the fact that these documents are disintegrating in a similar way to a building, there's a parallel there, because neither of those things are permanent, neither of those things are forever. And then how do we wrestle with that is how I came into it. And I think that's why I explicitly call it a fragmentary archive, and I explicitly write with it in that sense. And each of my chapters looks at different, one of them looks at the artworks that came out of about the building after the fact, or the way the building has been represented in artwork. And another one looks at oral histories, and another one looks at navigating the archive of the building, and another one sets it within the larger scale of the city, because I wanted to navigate the readers to provide the historical information, to provide a narrative, but explicitly through the archive, explicitly saying that this existed in this place and what does that say, as opposed to using that to fuel an archive, fuel the narrative per se, if that makes sense. That's why I think it's important to be explicit, especially because I'm trying to make a methodological theoretical intervention in the approach. I want the archive to be an agent in my work as well, because this building didn't make it into traditional archives.
Thanks. I mean, I just want to intervene very briefly. I mean, does this mean that there is also an affected relationship between the historian and the material? Because, I mean, what sets or distinguishes what we do as architectural historians from reportage? That is, because again, you mentioned reportage, you mentioned journalism, and that's the method that they follow, right? Like, so my concern really is with the longevity of historical writing, that when we record this, for how long is it going to be valid? Like, because a newspaper report is valid for a very brief period of time. I mean, new facts come to light and it changes, right? And in the way we write histories, how do we negotiate these very non-linear sort of, I really am excited by what you said about the uncomfortable facts sitting together, and how do we then, what is our output? What is our output and how long does it last for? I mean, this is an important question that your work raises, right? That how long is it going to be read for and how long does it remain valid? That I mean, if you have any initial thoughts, I'm not saying that there has to be a definitive answer to this question at this point, but definitely that's something to think about, right? That if you
This is something
construct,
that
yeah,
this is something that I think about often, because as I keep working on this project, especially as artists keep working on it, and then the objects move from one owner to another, these pieces of the building or different works come out, every time I return to the field, there might be something new, which also makes it quite difficult because I'm starting from the now. Even though the building's gone, there's often something new. So it becomes hard to put an endpoint. And when do I stop? When do I stop writing? Because there's no neat bow that something can be wrapped in. There often can be interventions. And as I write and think and work with these artists as well, and how their perceptions of these buildings have been articulated in their work, this becomes a constant question that I have. But for me, because the Soysa building, even though the newspapers reported on it and they're like, this is really important, and often the reports were like 2 paragraphs. For me, I do view the work I did and the oral histories I took and the archives that I have gathered into my dissertation, not only as my dissertation is writing architectural history, but is also creating an archive in the process. So if somebody in the future wants to return to this building and access it and then do something else, they have a starting point here. They have a collection of archives here. So I'm right now trying to figure out, with permission from my interlocutors, to figure out how best would be to share these oral histories. Would that be an archive? Would it be a website with the recordings, or would that be essentially transcriptions? Because I want to view my work not necessarily as something static. It's not something that it'd be great if people read it for a while, but as something that people can engage with, as a place to understand, to get the sources as well, if they want to return to it and then maybe even disagree with me.
yeah, that's interesting, because I think then we are sort of being pushed into the realm of digital humanities, and how that sort of is always in a state of flux. And because again, you're looking at oral histories, and because my question was about the object of what you produce. So whether, when you're saying that you're producing an archive, what medium is that archive in? Is it the recording? Is it the interviews that you did? Is it an audio file rather than? So, I mean, thanks for that, because I think that these are some of the problems that we are dealing with even while doing global histories and writing global histories, that depending on the perspective or the vantage that you adopt, the historical narrative changes, and this is completely, yeah. I mean, I think more than the narrative, the archive has more longevity. Maybe that's my takeaway almost from what you're saying. Which brings me to
Pedro, I
again,
think Saptarshi, Pedro is trying to say something. I don't.
yeah, Pedro, do you want to come in, please? You wanna,
Yeah, look, I think very interesting both presentations. I think one of the things that it raises for me is this idea that historians have, which is to do with ritualizing a process which leads to a conclusion. And I think in the sense of multiple narratives, this is a forlorn task. And but there is validity in there being multiple interpretations. And I think a historian can actually present various interpretations without trying to get them to some conclusion. I mean, these things can exist in parallel, because for the people reporting their memories, those things have a reality which is probably equally as valid to things that are written on paper in some archive that are crumbling in Pamudu's hands. So I think it raises. I mean, a lot of what historians do is they rely on documentary evidence. That you mentioned evidence as the controlling thing, but there must be many types of evidence, and I think that in respect of buildings and built works in places that are in flux, there are likely to be many more interpretations than you would have in a sort of more or less stable situation where most histories have been written heretofore. I think maybe there's a kind of future which allows for diversity of various kinds. I mean, how one does it is an open question.
Can I sort of add a thought here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Hi, everyone. And I perhaps would speak for the Omitted Histories project, but I might speak for a few other community archiving projects that we have worked on. And I think I just want to connect and add to the point that Pamudu and Pedro made. Would it be right, or would it be right to provoke that the role of a historian is more than just writing histories now, perhaps, or in the recent years? And why I say this is because community as an archive, or archives built off community histories itself, also needs to be questioned in terms of who is preserving it, who is presenting it, how is it being presented and preserved. And something that we have been able to work with so far, and of course it comes back to Omitted Histories project as well, is to actually open up channels of interpretation. So while Pedro, thanks for saying that we could leave it for more interpretations, but the fact that we have also found ways, whether it's through YouTube videos or films or community engagement through different forms of media, Pamudu, in your case, even being able to see the artist's interpretation first and then see the archives, sort of reinstates perhaps the need for histories to be written out in more forms rather than just reportage or fact-telling or storytelling or maybe an argument building, but historians having more forms of practices when it comes to working with communities. I wouldn't say speaking for them or speaking about them, but working with them, which could be more collaborative, which could be more co-curatorial. So that is one thing I wanted to mention. And second, if I might provoke, I think we're also calling these archives fragmentary because the process of archiving behind it seems to be missing. Because we now work with building a lot of archives, when we think about the institutional archives, which has been seen as an evidence for a very long time, they were equally fragmentary. If I was to take away the catalog from the back, and if I was to take away some of the archival processes in the way that the structure which it is laid out in, they are no less than these loose photographs tied with some metadata, tied with some interpretation or storytelling or the history by an archivist. And perhaps over here, the process has inversed itself. But why is one so fragmentary in nature? And that seems to be a point of question, whereas one, under the umbrella of an institution, suddenly feels tied down, because there are, of course, as most historians face, there are equal amount of gaps there as well. And perhaps they don't really become the binaries in the kind of conversation that seems to be bringing out. So these are two important points I thought as a methodology worth thinking about, more roles for a historian, and definitely how archives are built, and why we feel something has more gaps compared to something else has lesser gaps. And then who owns these archives or who presents them?
Yeah, I think that's...
I-
Yeah, please, Pam.
No, Ishita, I really agree with you about the fragmentary nature of all archives, because the place that I actually use the fragmentary nature of the archive the most is when I'm theoretically in my writing is when I'm talking about what I found at conventional archives. Because I think like you emphasized, there's an assumption of oral histories or non-conventional capital A archives of already being fragmentary. And I think for me, it's important to emphasize that all of it is fragmentary. Nothing provides a holistic, like a whole understanding or complete understanding of anything, because somebody decided what was important or something was left behind that then ended up in an archive or somewhere else.
No,
Yeah, and I think
think
even
the
the
important point that sorry, Ishita, were
I
you
just
saying
wanted to add, even the factual
Yeah,
truth of
Sarah.
the institutional archive is not to be taken for granted, because especially if you look at the building site, we've come across budgetary reports and letters which contradict each other and which show that budgetary reports are being, alterated. So the factual truth, even of an institutional archival document, has to be equally questioned. And source criticism, I think, applies to all types of evidence, right? Whether it's an oral history account or an archival document. And in our writing, as we take those contexts of making into account, whether it's of oral testimony or as we write about these contexts of making, I think we are automatically also leaving behind the idea of linear history, because we are looking at it from the present. We are looking at how do I read the context in which this testimony or this letter was written? And so your own position comes in, and that means that you're moving away from this linear historical narrative where you're only talking about the past. You're actually talking from the present about the past and positioning yourself in the work. And I think that makes it fascinating, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this reminds me of what somebody like Dipesh Chakraborty had said about the public and the cloistered lives of history, which is where there is the academy in which history is written, and there is also the politics in which history is produced and realized on an everyday basis. So I think that the work that we saw from both bodies of work that we saw really makes the public life of producing history extremely vivid. And I think that's where the real value lies. I don't know if Yakin wanted to make any interventions or and then we can just open the floor. Pedro's already made some comments, and if others want to like intervene or share their observations, that would be great. Yakin, do you want to comment?
Yeah, thank you so much. And one of the images I want to start with is what Sarah showed us, where there is the Shanivar Vada, I guess, in the background, if I'm not wrong, and the bridge in front. And I think that was a very striking image for me, knowing a bit of the context of Pune and your work. So you have this structure, which is actually a Maratha period structure, if I'm not wrong, again, of the Peshwa period. And you have this colonial structure being built and this being photographed. And there is clearly this understanding of I don't know if I can call this a generational kind of a thing, or maybe a sense of time, which is definitely there within this kind of a photograph, right? So there is a sensibility of time when we are engaging with these communities of transformation, of change, which is recorded in the memory of these communities. And how do we as historians deal with different kinds of ideas of time which are embedded in the community? And this also goes to Pamudu's question, where there is a time which is like an archival, maybe if we can call it that, an archival kind of a repository of time, which marks that this is the date, this is what happened, blah, blah, blah. And there's also this idea of a memory of time wherein, he remembers from his childhood that XYZ, was found in the building. So how are these two parallel times, if not multiple, at least, if these two parallel times, if not more again, are prevalent or can be accessed as a scholar? How do we start thinking about them?
Interesting in this regard, when I was speaking to the Wadari women, especially, they didn't remember the years necessarily, but then they would place themselves in, like, this was in Indira Gandhi's time, for instance, or this was in, so the milestones are different. So how do we as historians probably will use dates, but yeah, I think is there a way of incorporating these kind of reference points? I'm not sure, because then, I mean, we're also speaking as, I cannot pretend to speak as being one of their community members, right? So it's a balance between your own position and your own.
And I think that is where
Yeah.
the output of building an archive, an output as a historian who wants to write, or an output
Yeah.
of curating an experience would separate itself out. Because an archive as a form or a structure or as a container can make room for different concepts of time. And it can read the same language as the community or mention the same milestone. Whereas, rightly so, as Sarah said, that as a writer, you might choose to, of course, build your position about that notion of time, or bring in another opinion in contrast or in complement. And again, when it comes to a more curated or a collective experience, these notions can be opened up for more